Hello my dear day olds and night monkeys, good morning and evening and welcome back to another video. I am so happy to have you all here. So, the third tier list video is taking a bit longer to make, mainly because I also have stuff to do for school and whatnot, and I like to pour a lot of love in my tier list videos. So yeah, I hope I can finish that one before Christmas. No promises though, as always. Anyway, I am now making a video that I hopefully get to finish in November, just so that I can pretend to myself that I actually follow an upload schedule somewhat. Let's get started. Ah, Pokemon sizes. Don't we all love the tiny Tropiuses and giant Larvestas? I think every Pokemon fan has at least one sort of joke or fun fact about Charizard being short or Wailord dwarfing literal space snake gods. And if you're one of the two people that actually watched one of my tier list videos and now clicked on this one, you would know that I have bitched on about multiple Pokemon being too small for my liking. But I ask myself, is my bitching justified? Am I right to think that Pokemon are too small on average? What even is the average of Pokemon, and how do the different generations of Pokemon compare to each other size-wise? Basically, I completely lost track of the original question and instead now made this video, in which I meticulously counted every Pokemon of every generation, calculated the average size of every generation, compared them, made a bunch of graphs and charts, and now I am making a video analyzing them. I haven't been diagnosed for ADHD yet, but I wonder if at this point I still need to. Anyway, to quickly explain my work process, I took a list of all Pokemon, specifically this one right here, and then I made a list for each generation of Pokemon, which I wrote down like this. Don't worry, I also made nicer looking graphs, which I will blend in instead of my horribly ugly notes, but you will see that in a bit. The important thing to mention here is that I used each Pokemon national dex number to calculate these numbers. This is important because it means that I did not count regional forms in any way, because they occupy the same dex entries as their original forms. Same goes for Megas or Gigantamax or some other different forms as well, but basically you only get counted if you have your own dex number, but you will see how I will change that. For most Pokemon this doesn't make a lot of difference whatsoever, but of course there is also Alolan Executor, which with its considerable height of 10 meters would have probably boosted Gen 7's height chart by quite a bit. But for the sake of trying to keep any rules here, I didn't count it. Also, just let me foreshadow a bit now, Generation 7 really doesn't need that boost in size, so that's that. Lastly, on the topic of keeping any rules whatsoever, I will definitely break my own rules in this video multiple times, or at least bend them a lot to fit whatever point I will try and make. This will be most obvious when different forms come into the mix, as I will decide which different forms are worth taking into account and which aren't based on vibes. For example, I won't just ignore the size difference between the two Giratina forms, but when it comes to the Shaman forms, you'll have to excuse my unwillingness to take into account the 20 centimeter difference that the Sky form and Land form have going on here. Basically, my point here is that there are infinite ways to count and calculate the average height of Pokemon, and that the way I did it is very much not the objectively right way to do it. I'm just trying to have a bit of fun with numbers here, alright? If you desperately want to know how things change if you count things differently, I implore you to do your own video of that. Chances are anyone else making a video on this will probably have an equal, if not more views than I will have. No one sees these videos anyway, so I make it mostly for myself. But without further ado, let's get into the meat of this.
Then come on, girl, ready to play. Let's have it all that swinging today. In the land of Fu Manchu, the girls all down to Susan Q. Clap your hands in the center of the floor, saying ting ting hop till you sing so long.
Starting with Gen 1, we have the most well-known of numbers, that being the original 151 Pokemon of Kanto, which when put up on the size chart, looked like this. Something that should become immediately obvious is the absolute dominance by Pokemon that are exactly 1 meter big. And you know, when I started with this, I expected the following generations to also be mainly around a meter tall, but interestingly, without spoiling too much, they vary quite a bit on which size has the most Pokemon in it. Anyway, not to get caught up in a comparison just yet, I want to mention an interesting quirk that starts right here in Generation 1, which every gen after it also has. That being the small group of sizes right here that I will call the Conventional Height Extreme Exodus Zone Ensemble, short, cheese. And what's interesting here is that every generation has their own cheese. On every chart, you will see that somewhere past 2.5 meters, or sometimes before, sometimes after, and before we hit 3 meters, there will be a sort of pause with no Pokemon until we then get to the cheese, in which basically Game Freak has all the outliers of a generation. Now, of course, these outliers aren't all exactly next to each other, even though this chart makes it look like that. They are still all a few meters or so apart from each other. But I still find it interesting that there is still always a group of Pokemon that are quite a large margin bigger than the rest, acting as a sort of balancing tool so that each generation is not overwhelmed by the sheer amount of Pokemon that are 1 meter or smaller. Although in the first generation, the Pokemon in cheese are mostly normal Pokemon like Onix or Dragonair or Gyarados. We will see that these slots will be taken mostly by somewhat special Pokemon in the future. Anyway, to finish up the first generation, I have added together all the Pokemon size into one, giving us 180.4 meters. Divided that by the amount of Pokemon we counted, the original 151, which gives us a nice and uneven 1.195 meters as the average size of Pokemon in the games where it all started. And because we can't really do a lot with this average for now, we will jump to the second generation now.
Clap your hands and come on, girl. Ready to play, let's have it. Move that thing in the day. In the land of Fu Manchu, the girls all now do Susan Q. Clap your hands in the center of the floor, saying ding ding hop, do it ding dong.
Starting with Gold and Silver, the second generation is made up from a clean 100 Pokemon, which when put in a size chart look like this. The first difference that immediately comes to mind is that by now, the far biggest group of Pokemon is 0.6 meters or 60 centimeters, which is made up from 15 Pokemon. What is also interesting is that they apparently really regretted having made so many Pokemon 1 meter tall in the first generation, as here we only have 2 that are exactly 1 meter tall. Although there's still plenty of Pokemon that are around the 1 meter mark. Something that we can also see quite quickly is that the cheese is a lot smaller than the previous one, only having 3 Pokemon, that being Ho-Oh, Lugia and Steelix. Also, the cheese starts a lot earlier than before, because the next biggest Pokemon only being at 2.3 meters in comparison to the Generation 1's 2.5. If we now add everything together and divide it by the number of Pokemon again, we get the average that is 1.154 meters, which is 0.04 meters smaller than the previous one we looked at. And considering that the second generation not only had 51 less Pokemon, it was also the generation that introduced breeding and baby Pokemon. So I think that is the reason we see a lot less bigger Pokemon, and it could also explain the spike right here at 0.6 meters. I mean, it introduced breeding, so it would make sense for Game Freak to put more effort into creating more Pokemon that have pre-evolutions which can be hatched from eggs. And more pre-evolutions means more smaller Pokemon. However, even considering all that, I think it's impressive that the second gen is only 0.04 meters shorter than the first one. And with that, we are also done with Generation 2 for now. So we can go on to the third one, which will certainly have its own quirks as well.
Then clap your hands and come on, girl. Ready to play, let's have it. Move that thing in the day. In the land of Fu Manchu, the girls all now do Susan Q. Clap your hands in the center of the floor, saying ding ding hop, do it ding dong.
Beginning with Ruby and Sapphire and later on also adding Emerald, the third generation of Pokemon is not only special for giving us Mudkip, but it is also quite special in its average size. Now, to skip unnecessary detail, the average size of the Pokemon of Hoenn lay at about 1.125 meters, making it the smallest generation by quite a bit. However, in this here figure I have yet to include one Pokemon. You might have already guessed which one it is. Wailord truly is massive by a comparison to most other Pokemon. So massive in fact that its inclusion or exclusion decides whether or not the third generation falls a few centimeters shorter than the previous gen, or if it's larger than both the second and first generation. Wailord alone adds 0.1 meters to the average, which I understand doesn't sound like a lot, but let me put this into perspective. The next biggest Pokemon of the third generation is Rayquaza with 7 meters, and Wailord dwarfs that. To accurately show Wailord on this chart, I would have to double its length from the point of Rayquaza, and only then you could see the difference between it and Wailord. Otherwise, I also have the screenshot from Pokemon Stadium or something, I think, where the Pokemon have their cannon sizes. I mean, what is this? Rayquaza looks like a chew toy. However, the point I want to make here is that Wailord is such a huge outlier, I think that I need to do something about it to make this fairer. But on the other hand, I also don't just want to exclude Pokemon that are very big. Wailord's not the only one, I mean, and there's also kinda no objective reason to not count them. But because I think that extreme outliers like Wailord kinda drastically increase the average size of their generation, I have decided that in cases like this, I will both use a biggest and a smallest case average. This will only become important in the end comparison, in which I will compare all the gens, once in their biggest and smallest forms, so basically you can't be mad at me for that, as I do both. I will have a average including Pokemon that are so drastically out of range like Wailord, and I have one that simply don't include them, just to get a better look at what maybe the actual average of most Pokemon is. Anyway, other smaller things to note here are that, for one, 0.6 meters is again the biggest group of Pokemon, just like in Gen 2, but, in contrary to the second gen, they apparently lifted their ban on 1 meter tall Pokemon, as we now have 10 again. Lastly to mention is that this time around the cheese also starts very early. You could argue that it's immediately after 2.1, but I will stay on the safe side and say it starts after 2.3. And that's all I can think of for this generation.
Stand there, girl, and clap their hands, and come on, girl, ready to play. Let's have it, move that thing in the day. In the land of Fu Manchu, the girls all down to Susan Q. Clap their hands in the center of the floor, saying ting ting, hop to his wings all
Generation 4! The generation of okay games followed by a banger third version, only to then be followed by the worst remakes ever made. Luckily those count as the 9th generation and thus will completely be ignored. Before I did this generation, I expected that Gen 4 would be the tallest out of the ones I did for now, mainly because its whole shtick was that it added a whole lot of new evolutions for older Pokemon, and well, newer evolutions tend to be bigger than their pre-evolutions. So, turns out that expectation was wrong if you look at the chart, cause holy moly, look at all those smaller Pokemon that are even smaller than 1 meter. That is, impressive. Like, they even have quite a large cheese in this generation. It's a bit hard to distinguish because it's right next to each other, but right after 2.5 meters, they have 5 Pokemon that are 3.2 meters or bigger. But that simply ginormous amount of Pokemon that are smaller than 1 meter just outweighs everything on the other side. Okay, side note here, just for the sake of transparency, the amount of Pokemon under 1 meter is proportionally big in comparison to the other gens. The total amount of Pokemon underneath 1 meter is actually not that much higher, if at all, to the previous generations. So just so no one calls me a liar here, I specifically am talking proportionally here, okay? You can see a 10 here, a 20 there. Makes sense, right? Okay, back to the chart. Now, when calculating the average height of Gen 4 Pokemon, I will again make a biggest and a smallest version of the average. That is not because there is a Wailord type situation, but it is because of the 2 forms of Giratina. Now, you might say that Palkia and Dialga need this too, because they had so-called origin forms added in as well in Legends Arceus. Origin... why is there an E there? Whatever. Well, my answer to that is that they should have added them back in Diamond, Pearl, Platinum if they wanted them to be counted in this video, because now they won't! Fuck! So with the short Giratina, we have an average height of 1.124 meters, while with the long Noodle Snack Giratina, we have 1.165 meters. Aye, we're on a roll here, let's go to the next couple of games. Couple of games being my favorite games of the Pokemon franchise. Black and White, as well as their sequel games, did not only make the most compelling story of any Pokemon game to this day, fight me on that, but they also added the most Pokemon in a single generation to this day. Whopping 156 Pokemon, this generation's size chart looks like this. Now, this might seem like a very uneven distribution, which is because it is a very uneven distribution, but even with that uneven distribution, due to the large amount of Pokemon in this gen, as well as the quite bigly sized cheese, we got an average size of 1.24 meters. Except I kinda lied to you here just now, as in Generation 5 a bunch of Pokemon have different forms too. Some are smaller and some are bigger than their original forms, so what I did was calculate how many more meters would be added if every Pokemon was in their alternative forms. All in all, adding in the height of Pokemon that get bigger, as well as subtracting all those that get smaller. So for all of that, I will add 1.8 meters to all the Pokemon sizes combined, giving us an average of 1.251 meters. Although that doesn't really make any difference at all, as even the shorter version of Gen 5 is still the biggest version to this point, even beating Gen 3's Wailord average. But somehow, Gen 5 accomplished all of this while also managing to add the first smallest Pokemon of them all. If you didn't know, Pokemon sizes get counted in 10cm steps, and this generation is actually the first one to give us our first of many 10cm tall Pokemon. That one being the bestest of bug boys, Shouldnt. And I must certainly say, things are looking up with this gen. They managed to give us a bigger average than ever, even with the farthest cheese outlier being far away from any Wailord kind of situation, and they even gave us the teeny tiny Joltik, meaning that they actually did just make a generation of Pokemon that were just taller in general than the generations before. Things are looking up, and if this keeps going, maybe we won't have embarrassingly small space snakes or banana dinosaurs anymore. Don't this all just make one feel hopeful for the future? So let's get to the next generation. Oh. Oh no. Generation 6. Oh boy, Generation 6. As much as I like X and Y as games, even I must admit that Game Freak really didn't do the jump to 3D well. From static and expressionless models to an unfinished region to tons of scrapped content. X and Y really had a rough time in development and publishment. And sadly it also shows in its Pokemon. And I don't mean the quality of the individual Pokemon. Those are great. But I am talking about the literal amount of Pokemon, or rather the lack thereof. This is the size chart of the 6th generation, which might not look so bad, but this is the size chart in relation to the chart of Pokemon Black and White. Yeah, that's really not a lot. X and Y almost had 30 less Pokemon than the previous lowest generation Pokemon count back in Gen 2. And the saddest thing is that they apparently started to cut out the bigger Pokemon first. I mean, their cheese is just bigger by 1, maybe 2 Pokemon than that of Generation 2, but at least Gold and Silver had enough resources for Pokemon that are 1.4, 1.9 meters big. But even if that didn't convince you of the smallness of Gen 6, this is the average height of Pokemon in that gen. That's almost 0.1 meters smaller than the previous shortest generation. Now, that are only 10 centimeters, but considering the dimensions we are having these averages in, that is quite substantial. I don't even have a lot to say about this one that hasn't already been said, so it's quite obvious that this generation's lack of sizes comes from the fact that it was simply rushed and delivered basically unfinished to what was planned. I guess I should mention the follow-up of the smallest little boy with just the smallest tiny flower. But then again, I really like most, if not all, of these Pokemon designs from this generation, so this is in no way shade towards those. Just like, take more time next time, Game Freak. You've got enough money, it's gonna be fine. Please, just, you can be taller Pokemon. Fine, it will be. Generation 7 comes in giving us more hope yet again by adding more Pokemon than before. I mean, it's still the second lowest amount of them, but it's also still 10 more Pokemon in comparison to Gen 6. Also, they overhauled the people models, they took time writing a story, made an intro as long as a Marvel movie, even though I still liked it, and in contrast to the previous entries on this list, they actually made the whole region accessible! Except for one stupid golf course that for some reason is really prevalent on the map. Why, Game Freak? Why don't you just put a big green lawn with nothing on it. At least let me enter! My point is that they did redeem themselves on many points they missed in the previous generation. At least in my opinion, but like in many aspects of life, the internet does seem kinda a bit more divided on that. I wonder why. Moving on, we'll take a look at the size chart now. As you can see, this is actually looking quite unbalanced. The scales seem tipped more to smallness than ever, especially so as this time around, the 0.3 meter mark is the biggest group. However, I would like for you to move your attention towards the cheese, and soon you shall see why things are not as they might seem at first. The cheese of Sun and Moon is massive! And I mean, just counting the amount of Pokemon here, it's almost twice as big as the cheese of Black and White. But also when looking at the actual sizes, it is actually not bigger than Black and White, as we have 5 Pokemon alone that are taller than 5 meters. And taking this cheese into account, we can see the absolute massive average size of Pokemon being at 1.503 meters at its biggest. If we take the small version of Washi Washi and the Crossbar, we are quite a bit shorter with 1.355 meters, yet it is still a lot bigger than every previous generation. And they managed to do that even though they don't have a single Pokemon in all these spaces. The waste, man. But ignoring that, why is this? Before this, it always seemed like the less Pokemon a generation had, the smaller it was. So why does this generation, with the second least amount of Mons, beat all the others out of the water? With its size, I mean. Well, it's because of a thing that Game Freak likes to do in this generation that they kind of repeat in Gen 9. A special group of Pokemon that are supposed to be important without being legendary. In this case, that's the Ultra Beasts. Think about it. These Pokemon are supposed to be seen as a world threat, something that previously only legendaries could really achieve, a threat level with which the whole region might be destroyed. But this time around, Game Freak wanted to have a whole section of Pokemon that fall under that category, without all of them being legendary. I mean, having 30 legendaries in a single gem would be quite a lot. So, how do you manage that? How do you make Pokemon more imposing if they're not supposed to be legendaries? Well, you make them real big. And that's what they did. Look at all these tall Ultra Beasts, and basically that's the reason for Gen 7's jump in height. They had a small amount of Pokemon, but proportionally a lot of basically legendaries, at least size-wise. So yeah, that did surprise me when I made this chart. So I guess if you hate this generation, you are wrong, because it's taller than your favorite gen. That's basically what it's all about, isn't it?
Come on, girl, ready to play, let's have it, move that thing in the day. In the land of Fu Manchu, the girls all now do Susan Q. Clap their hands in the center of the floor, saying ting ting, hop to the wings all night.
Generation 8! My absolute least favorite gen. Or at least a strong contender for it. I think it's not a hot take on the internet to not like the 8th generation of Pokemon. Sword and Shield were very much subpar games in my opinion. I would choose any previous gen before it any day. To be fair, I didn't play the DLC for that game, but if the main game was already as bad as it was, I don't think I need to justify not buying the DLC for it, no matter how great people might say it is. Anyway, I am not here to hate on Sword and Shield today. I am talking about its Pokemon. Their sizes specifically. Though I have to also mention here that I do like the Pokemon of Gen 8. Just the games are bad, not the Pokemon designs. Anyway, not to get caught up more, here we have its size chart. Again, for some reason the biggest group of Pokemon here are the 30 centimeter big ones, just like in Sun and Moon. I guess they just really like 30 centimeters. Anyway, looking past the weird gaps they got here again, we turn our attention to the cheese. And wowza, it's real big this time around as well. We got quite a lot of big Pokemon right here, not to mention the absolute behemoth that is Endonalos. That thing is literally 6.5 meters bigger than even Wailord. Truly the biggest of boys. However, considering how I calculated 2 versions of Gen 3 because of Wailord, I can't really justify not doing that again because, well, the size of that thing. However, I need to say here that I will not count the Pokemon of Legends Arceus at all. Mainly because while Legends is technically a spin-off game of the 8th generation, it is really kinda treated like a weird type of mainline game. I mean, it was literally the first kinda open world Pokemon game, because I do not count the Wild Zone of Sword and Shield as open world. But yeah, I think those games and Pokemon in it were thought out after Sword and Shield were released. Also, the new Pokemon of Legends Arceus have actually no connection to all the mainline games. Heck, they're supposed to be extinct or evolved to do something else at that point. Mainly, I just want to sidestep any potential headaches this might cause. In any case, here we have the average height of Sword and Shield Pokemon, once without any Lullas and once with it included. Those falling at 1.165 meters and 1.393 meters respectively. This time around, I really have no explanation for why this gen is taller than a lot of previous ones, except the 7th. I guess Sword and Shield just had quite a few big Pokemon. One of the few good things of this gen. Also, if I would have included Legends Arceus, the average size would have been 1.455 meters. Thanks, bye! Finally, the last generation. It took too long to get here. This video was supposed to be a short one, just like something for in between. I need to stop yapping so much. Anyway, not to waste any more time, let's take a good look at this beautiful size chart for the most recent generation, which I just want to say is also a contender for my least favorite generation. Haha! I immediately want to point out the fact that for some reason, tied for the biggest size group is 1.2 meters as well as 0.3 meters again! I really don't know why they like 30 centimeters so much, but they really gave me a theme over the last few gens. Anyway, apart from that, they seem to have, this time around, developed an utter hatred towards Pokemon that are 1.7 meters big. Why? I don't know, I got me no idea. Moving on, I will shift your attention towards the cheese yet again, which also yet again is quite big again. I mean, they got 3 Pokemon that are 3.5 meters long here alone. And just like in Generation 7, I have an explanation for this one again. While Sun and Moon had Ultra Beasts, Scarlet and Violet added Paradox Pokemon to that mix. And just like with Ultra Beasts, how do you make Pokemon seem legendary without them being actually legendary? You make them big. Apart from that, we also got an utter behemoth here again with the inclusion of Dondozo. Dondo? I remember? I don't know. Anyway, by now you should know how this goes. We make 2 separate averages. Yay! And to not beat around the bush, the shortest version of Generation 7 we have here is 1.258 meters, while the inclusion of Dondozo scales it up to the very respectable 1.358 meters. And that already brings us to the end about this segment for the last generation, or, well, for now, last generation. And I would tell you how they compare to other generations, but why would I if I don't simply just show you? And here we have the nice comparison graphs that we were working towards this entire video. I will label them as the biggest and smallest respectively. Now, what I think is interesting is that both show quite a similar story in Pokemon's development. Just kinda different levels of extremes, or maybe just different viewpoints. In both the smallest and the biggest graph, we can see that the first 4 generations didn't provide a lot of change. And when only looking at the biggest size graph, this extends to the 5th one as well. They kinda were doing the same stuff until that point, releasing round about a few more than 100 Pokemon every gen, sometimes adding new evolutions, but fundamentally not really changing that much. Up until this point, there's mostly just normal Pokemon, and then a handful of legendaries and a few very big exceptions of normal Pokemon that made up the cheese of each generation. However, when looking at the smallest graph, you could say that it started changing in Gen 5 already, considering that it was the first time ever for the average size to increase. However, I do not believe this to be a conscious decision by Game Freak. I believe the reason for the, let's call it, overperformance of the 5th gen is due to them being a bit more experimental in this generation. I mean, Pokemon Black and White really were the first ones to have more Pokemon than the first generation even, with 165. Also, they started to play around with the level sizes a lot more. And by that I mean that for the first time around we had Pokemon that evolved at level 60, something that they haven't really done before or all that much since. But what I think is most important is that the setting or the vibes of these games is a lot more, let's say, adult. I mean, it's still a children's game, no question there, but they were also the first games of the franchise to fundamentally question the things we were doing with the Pokemon in the games, as well as the evil team almost acting like a kind of political extremist group, and having the political extremist group act as the ones that kind of make a bit of moral sense, don't you think? I mean, we're basically just having cockfights here. Though I think this is best shown in the fact that the protagonists were deliberately aged up from the typical 11 or 12 to 14 or 15 years old. And, be it a conscious decision or not, I think the world kinda aged and sized up together with the story and protagonists. It really makes me wonder how Gen 6 would have looked like if they stayed on this 2D path for a generation longer. But to get back to reality, Gen 6 is when it all kinda collapsed. The jump to 3D was handled mediocre at best, and it showed. With basically half of Kalos getting scrapped, so did probably a lot of Pokemon. It only makes sense for this generation to be the smallest. However, after that we can see how we boost ourselves back up and beyond in Generation 7, and then kinda flatten us towards Gen 9. And to basically recap myself here, this is due to the fact that after Gen 6 they started to put a lot more focus on generational gimmicks. I mean, that's basically the reason as to why Gen 7 and 9 perform so high in the smallest graphs, as they simply have more large Pokemon instead of one 20-meter long one. And I think this also kinda proves my point on why I made a smaller and bigger graph. While yes, the bigger graph is technically more accurate, I think the smaller one better represents the actual trend in Pokemon. Gen 5, 7 and 9 are a lot higher in this one because, well, they had more bigger Pokemon that a player was likely to use. The only reason Gen 3 or 8 were as high up as they were is because of one titanic behemoth each gen. And I think that kinda takes away from the ultimate point I was trying to research, which was looking at the size of generations and see how the averages can be interpreted. Personally, I think it's more useful to look at the graph that tells me more about most Pokemon. I mean, how many people actually used Wailord in their playthroughs? Not to mention that Dunno is literally the big bad at the end of the game. But before I keep talking in circles just to justify myself on something that no one cares about, I want to come to an end here. I think this basically shows that even if I overanalyze the size of every gen, even if I look at the cheese of every game, even if I take the biggest into account, we are still looking at the averages in the room of 1 meter and 1.5 meters. And that really isn't a lot, objectively speaking. So while I love the idea of giant dinosaurs or dragons or mechs, I do have to see that Pokemon never actually try to have kaijus running around their world. Pokemon were always meant to be big enough, for small enough in that case, to be imagined in a daily routine kind of setting. If Pokemon were real, I think the creators would have envisioned people just going on a tram with their Tyranitas, doing groceries with their Metagross, or going on a stroll in the park with their Tropius. They're called pocket monsters after all, aren't they? I mean, I will still keep bitching about Pokemon being too small, but I understand the world I wish for is one that never actually existed. And with that, I thank you for watching. If you interpreted something completely different into these stats than I did, be sure to let me know and tell me how wrong I was. Until then, goodbye, and I hope I finish my third tier list video someday. I don't know. Bye!